Good morning, everyone. All right, this is working. Excellent. I hope you all got a wonderful night's sleep and had good coffee this morning. I'm very much looking forward to this session. I want to get started right away because I know we have a number of great presentations, and I'd love to have time for some substantive questions at the end. So I'm Liz Koslov, and I'm just going to go straight in and introduce our first presenter today, who's Antonia Samur from the Earth Institute here at Columbia University. And you'll have 15 minutes. I'll wait around. Thank you.
And this. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Antonia, and I work at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness here at Columbia University's Earth Institute. Today, my presentation is about building long-term community resilience through child-focused disaster preparedness. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about the approach that we've had with the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities Initiative, which is an initiative being implemented by the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, which initially was done together with Save the Children, funded by a grant by GSK, pharmaceutical company. So my first question is what we understand by community resilience. So to sort of set the frame of the conversation. There's, of course, a lot of different disciplines that talk about community resilience in different ways, but the way we understand it in the disaster field is the ability of a community to absorb disturbances and to reorganize into a fully functioning system. Of course, we don't have a really well-defined idea of community resilience, but we have some notions of what we sort of understand by it. And so the EPA also has this definition, which is the ability of a community to anticipate risk, to prepare for, plan for, and recover from adverse disruptive events. And this is the way we're looking at community resilience through this initiative. And so why focus on children? And how do we actually achieve community resilience by focusing on children and disaster preparedness? So children have very unique needs that are exacerbated during disasters, whose vulnerabilities are exacerbated during disasters because they depend on adults and depend on so many systems in their communities and society to be safe and to have the ability to cope with disasters. And they're also normally not included in disaster preparedness and response plans, so they're often invisible when it comes to actually responding and preparing and then responding and then recovering from disasters. Also children, because they depend on so many adults and because they're basically still in development, they don't have necessarily all the abilities they need to cope with disasters, so they're also disproportionately affected by them, and I'll talk about their specific vulnerabilities in a second. And also there's like an ethical component to making sure that children are safe and that making sure that we minimize the effects of disasters over the long term of children, because basically with climate change, as disasters and extreme weather events increase in frequency and severity, the impacts on children can have really long-lasting effects over a child's life. And because they don't have the coping mechanisms most often, and because they depend on so many adults, we need to make sure that children are not the ones being mostly affected by something that they have no contribution to. So children's specific vulnerabilities, to kind of frame why is it so important for us to be talking about this. So they have, of course, the obvious physical vulnerabilities. They can die, they can be injured, they can experience illnesses and diseases with being more vulnerable to them than adults, especially vector-borne diseases, for example, after hurricanes like malaria and dengue, malnutrition, dehydration, if there's shortage of water and food after a disaster, also heat stress. Children's bodies are metabolically less able to actually cope with things like extreme heat, and also they can be exposed to physical and sexual abuse and neglect in general. There are also psychological vulnerabilities like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, emotional distress, sleep disorders, somatic complaints, and behavioral problems that can arise during and after a disaster, and these can have really long-lasting impacts over a child's life. And then there's educational vulnerabilities because during disasters, schools are often disrupted, and it really depends on the magnitude and the preparedness of a community to face that disaster, how many days of school a child might miss. So they can miss schools, and for example, in Puerto Rico, children miss schools for an average of 3 months. So they can also face poor academic performance due to all of the aforementioned vulnerabilities, delayed progress, and actually failure of completing education, all of which can have really long-lasting impacts on a child's life. So I just wanted to tell you a few of the exposures that children in Puerto Rico, which is one of the places where we're working with the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities initiative. So these are some of the some examples of the vulnerabilities exposures that children in Puerto Rico were actually exposed to. So there was a study conducted on about 100,000 school students led by the Department of Education in Puerto Rico, which basically the results said that 16% of children had a family or friend injured. 4% of them were actually injured themselves. 6% of them had to move schools. 83% saw their houses damaged, and 45% of them had saw houses damaged, and 45% had their own houses damaged. 58% of children had a member of their family or a friend leave the island. 32% experienced shortage of water and food. 85% of the children receiving special education services missed at least 3 months of discontinued services. Children missed an average of 3 months of schools, and then when they went back to school for about 3 months, also schools went back for half days. And yeah, so 20% of people lost their employment, 30% of people lost income. So all of these are effects that put children in a lot of distress and can cause all of these vulnerabilities. So why is this important? At the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, at the beginning of this initiative in 2015, we conducted a national survey to understand how well prepared American families are to face disasters. So there's a bunch of stats that I'm going to leave in my presentation in case you ever want to go back to see them, but one of the most important stats is that 65% of American households do not have adequate plans for disasters or do not have plans at all. And although Americans are in general confident in their community's ability to respond to a disaster, 45% of them are actually not confident that their community has a plan to actually respond and to meet their needs during a disaster. And 37% of them are not confident that their community has the ability to meet the needs of their children. So how does child-focused preparedness actually enhance community resilience? So now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into exactly what we're doing with the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities initiative. So the objective of the initiative is to improve and provide a sustainable environment for community resilience. And what do we mean by this? The idea is to get in the same table the representatives of child serving institutions and emergency management who are normally not at the same table to kind of basically on the same table to talk about what are the vulnerabilities within the community, what are the needs of child serving institutions to be well prepared to meet the needs of children. So why are we working? So our target audience is actually child serving institutions and not specifically children, because we believe that if child serving institutions are actually well prepared to meet their needs and go back to operations as soon as possible, then children can be well taken care of and families can go back to their recovery in their lives, basically. So by focusing on institutions, we make sure that families are able to, as quickly as possible, take care of response and recovery, and that children are safe with the systems that normally take care of them. So the idea of putting in the same table different sectors of child-serving institutions, schools, childcare centers, and emergency management is to cultivate cross-sectoral local partnerships in which the emergency management can actually help child-serving institutions in the child-serving sector be better prepared to meet the needs of children. So what do? We basically provide technical assistance, and we technical assistance to develop critical procedures, trainings, and planning guidance to protect and care for children. We also support coalition building. So the idea is for communities to to kind of come together in a coalition that can work over a long period of time, not just a few months before a disaster, but over, say, 2 or 3 years. So we sort of provide that structure for communities to create those coalitions, and we kind of support them along the way of determining priorities and determining action plans over a period of time. So one of the main components, as I was saying, of this initiative is the community resilience coalitions, what we call them. So it's basically a group of representatives of different sectors that kind of come together, they meet regularly, and they work on the priorities that they have identified as the most pressing needs in their communities for child-serving institutions. So the thing is that it's actually really hard to get emergency management at the table because they have so many other competing priorities. So this is something that it's definitely been a challenge to what we're doing, but getting them on the table has shown to be really really productive in terms of addressing the needs that child-serving institutions actually have related to preparedness and sort of and developing their response and recovery plans. So the idea is that stakeholders in those community resilience coalitions can identify and address the issues that in their community, and they can work in teams, they present findings, and they explore solutions and develop action plans, and we're kind of there to just support the work that they're doing. So another really important component of what we're doing is that so the National Center for Disaster Preparedness developed a Community Preparedness Index, which is a tool to measure the preparedness of different sectors within a community to meet the needs of children during and after disasters. It was developed for Save the Children in the context of the first phase of this initiative, which was implemented with them. So it's basically a self-assessment, so communities, different sectors, representatives of different sectors in the community get basically a questionnaire, and they kind of have to respond like how they're doing in their sectors in terms of the guidelines, the procedures and requirements and best practices to meet the needs of children during and after disasters. And these are the sectors that we include for this index: family, childcare providers, childcare centers, foster care, private public schools, hospitals, emergency management, and emergency shelters. So basically all of the sectors and institutions in which children are during the day or where they can be during and after a disaster. So for this initiative as well, the Resilient Children, Resilient Communities created a toolbox to basically compile all of the tools that we've been developing with our pilot communities during the first phase, and then with our second phase communities, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So we basically created this online repository of tools for communities to freely use. They're often like templates and checklists and things that any community can kind of come and look at and use to build child-focused community resilience in their own communities. So we continue to develop it. We're now adding more tools as we work with new communities. We're translating into Spanish because now we're working in Puerto Rico since this year. And so it basically provides more than 60 tools for families, child-serving institutions, emergency planners, and legislators to kind of set the frame of how to start working around these issues if they haven't yet, or to strengthen that work if they're already doing it. So I encourage all of you to go to the website. It's rcrctoolbox.org, and you can see for yourselves and maybe find something if you are interested in this. So during our first phase, which was from 2015 to 2018, we worked with 2 communities in Putnam County and Washington County. We worked with them basically during 3 years, helping them form community resilience coalitions and working with them in setting priorities. And sort of working through these priorities. So we implemented the Community Preparedness Index in the beginning at the end, and we saw a really sharp increase in their overall preparedness by sector. And the second phase, we're working with 4 community coalitions in North Carolina and Puerto Rico, and we're sort of like implementing the same model that we're implementing the lessons learned from that first phase into communities that are now recovering from disasters. So takeaways from the work that we're doing. First, disasters affect children disproportionately because they can experience really severe, long-lasting impacts. Children have unique needs that are exacerbated during disasters, and they're often actually invisible in the different phases of disaster planning. Including children in plans for all of these phases can enhance the community's ability to meet their needs and therefore recover more quickly. And children depend on social systems, so more focus should be put on strengthening systems and the institutions that take care of children. And also, social capital is such a fundamental factor for effective response and recovery process in a community. So this is also one of the things that we're doing through this initiative, making sure that the social connections and networks that need to be in place for children to be safe and continue to be safe even after a disaster and have the necessary coping tools are theirs. So by building these social networks within a community, we're trying to make sure that children are able to recover more quickly. So we think that a lot more should be done to focus on building social capital. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Antonia. So next we have Matthew Sanders from the Louisiana Office of Community Development.
Sure. Good morning. I appreciate everybody braving the rain to be here today. It's been 95 degrees in New Orleans. I was really looking forward to the change in weather, and it's done nothing but rain since I got here. But c'est la vie, as they say. My name is Matthew Sanders. I'm with the Louisiana Office of Community Development. I'm the Resilience Policy and Program Administrator. That's a long way of saying I manage a $92 million resilience grant the state received at the conclusion of the HUD-sponsored National Disaster Resilience Competition. And that covers two projects that specifically deal with the topic of managed retreat. One is called Louisiana's Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments, or LA SAFE. And that's an initiative that takes a macro regional scale to planning and development of projects related to the concept of managed retreat and thinking through the consequences of what we can reasonably expect to experience over the next 50 years. And the second is a project called the Resettlement of Ile-de-Jean Charles, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. That's more of a micro-level approach to a specific community. And so I'm going to talk a lot less about that project today because I think I'd like to highlight the big, broad approach that we think might be more scalable and replicable in places elsewhere. So to kind of key the remarks I'm going to make today, some of you may have seen in the New York Times yesterday this story asking the question, with more storms and rising seas, which U.S. cities should be saved first? And I think this speaks to the salient question that we're trying to deal with, and that from an engineering and science perspective, we know we can't save everybody, right? We understand that as water continues to get higher, as seas become warmer, as we experience the types of cataclysmic events that we've started to experience, specifically over the last 20 years, not every place is going to be viable for habitation moving forward, right? And so we have a series of very difficult decisions to make, really out over the next generation or two that I think will dictate what our landscape looks like from a development perspective moving forward in the age of climate change. So one of the things that I'll focus on through this talk is the idea that the people on the ground, the communities themselves, have to be an active participant in that conversation. Now, as an urban planner in my own right, I think the planning profession in some ways has gone too far in the direction toward essentially being a sieve for whatever we may hear when we engage with the community. And I don't think that's quite right either, in that we certainly have to have a science-based backbone to everything that we talk about. But communities themselves have to be an active participant. There's a role for democracy in figuring out what we're going to be as a series of communities moving forward in the age of vulnerability. So the LA SAFE project has been a planning and project effort, as I mentioned, across a 6-parish area of Louisiana. This was dictated by a specific disaster event, and there's a regulatory apparatus around all of that I won't spend much time on. But it ends up working out quite well for piloting purposes, in that this 6-parish area collectively represents about 8.5% of all payouts through the National Flood Insurance Program through its inception. So You talk about places that have been disproportionately impacted by significant disaster risk. Louisiana, in broad terms, is really on the front lines of that effect. And this 6 parish area specifically is really a place to focus on in finding places that have been disproportionately impacted. So as we went through this planning process, predominantly through 2017, the first takeaway that we started with and we engaged with communities on the ground on is this idea that Louisiana is losing land faster than we can rebuild it. So, we have something called the Coastal Master Plan. It's a $50 billion, 50-year plan to restore and protect our coastline. It's the keystone in Louisiana's effort to combat the effects of climate change, and that's an essential series of implementations. However, we also have to consider what the landscape is going to look like even under the best case scenario of the master plan being fully built out. And that's the perspective that we've taken here, to begin to lay out in stark visual terms what that looks like, what we think the impacts might be, and to begin to engage with those communities that are likely to be disproportionately impacted by those outcomes in a way that helps them envision what the future can and should look like. And so just to start with that premise of land loss and commensurate flood risk, this is Louisiana in 1960. This is Louisiana in 2017. And even under a relatively conservative scenario with build-out of the Coastal Master Plan, 2067, you could see obviously some of the benefits of the master plan and that we can restore some areas of our coastline. But from a comparative perspective, less land. Now, what that means in terms of surge flood risk specifically, so the easy way to read this map is the darker the blue, the worse off we are. This map gets significantly darker over a 50-year period of time, and there's less map there, right? And so I point that out for a couple of different reasons because, visualization is important. And I think we have a unique opportunity in Louisiana in that, everybody has either been directly impacted by a significant flood event themselves or is close to someone who has, right? So this is a series of events that have impacted everybody in Louisiana. We're kind of all on the same page that this is a problem. Now, obviously Louisiana is a deeply red state, so the topic of climate change is not one that I typically engage in the public, but nobody argues with the map, right? Nobody is arguing that Louisiana's, just fine and we're all going to be dandy and this is great. So we just have a common base with which to have a conversation. The second takeaway that we started with before directly engaging the public is, charting the effect of what all of these disaster events have meant, what long-term environmental degradation has meant on the ground in our lowest lying communities. And the effect is, people have begun to move away, right? And so as these series of significant, repetitive disaster events have taken place, people get fed up. And specifically, the people that get fed up and move away are the people with the financial means to get fed up and move away, right? And so what we see is in these low-lying communities that have lost population, we've also been able to document significant declines in median incomes, right? So we can begin to chart out a divide right there in the sense that the folks with financial means to move somewhere that's higher, drier, and safer, they generally take that decision and move somewhere higher, drier, and safer. And the folks that are unfortunately left behind are the people that are the most certainly financially vulnerable among us. So that kind of leads me to the basis of what has been this planning and project effort. And we started with a very simple premise that we wanted to, and note the first two words here, working together, right, for community resilience, economic prosperity, and a better quality of life for everyone in Louisiana. So what we did was we designed a series of 5 rounds of engagement events, and we started by going to the people and just laying out the information that I just presented to you with a basic question. A, how has this impacted you in the past? And B, what do you think we should do about it moving forward into the future based on the best information that we know about the future? And, I have to tell you, people thought we were crazy when we said that we were going to do this. I think there's been, a wrong-headed theory up to this point that you can't engage the public with bad news, right? What I would say is you can't engage the public with bad news without at least some idea as to how we all may collectively move forward from that bad news. But I think the public very much respects when somebody like me, who represents the government, shows up and tells them a full articulation of what we know to be true, right? So in terms of building trust, in terms of engaging in an active dialogue with folks that has been productive, it starts from a position of truth, right? And simply showing up on the ground and saying, tomorrow may not be a brighter day, I think lends itself to a condition by which we could have a realistic conversation. Now, one of the things that we found very quickly that was extremely promising is that when we laid this information out, people had a lot of really good ideas. And so we essentially asked the public to crowdsource a future land use map in the areas in which we worked, and what they came up with is just as good as anything I could have come up with as a professional planner, right? And the fact that I didn't come up with it, the fact that this was crowdsourced from the people on the ground who told us what their community should look like in the future, and the fact that it made sense based on everything that we know about future risk was really illuminating. And so from there, the project actually, kind of got easier, right? Because we were able to establish a basis by which we got intelligent information on the ground from people that are most likely to be impacted by these disaster events and increasing flood risk. And we were able to develop this premise that says, look, all of the development decisions that we make all across Louisiana in places that are primed to receive populations that are retreating from the coast, or those populations that may be doing the retreating, right? They have a say in helping us program all of our community development decisions based on what we know about risk and based on what matters most to them. And so from there, we kept going back to the public, and we kept refining this into a vision of ultimately what the future of these communities can and should look like. And so as that vision continued to become more refined, when it came time to pick projects, because that's ultimately what we do, it's a $40 million initiative, so you can only spend so much money on planning. We ended up with a universe of 36 projects across 6 parishes, and at this point, from the state's perspective, we thought they were all good. We thought they were all viable. And so as a final step, we went back to the public, and we asked them to vote and tell us what we should build for a demonstration project in their parish to illustrate the types of development activities that need to take place into the future commensurate with the risks that we know about. And so from that universe of 36, we were fortunately able to invest in 10 of those projects and programs. They're all under some various stage of implementation now. Pivoting from that project selection and the beginning of implementation, more recently, and this actually came out about a month ago, we released a series of 7 planning documents to synthesize all of the work that had been completed through this initiative. And so one of those documents is a regional document that kind of summarizes all of the big takeaways, and then each parish has their own document. And I say that because we've been quite fortunate to have received a lot of national media coverage in the last month on this, and I don't think I have read anything yet that has not referenced the fact that it's a 1,500-page set of documents. So for all of those reporters who went through those 1,500 pages, I commend them. But what we found was that, not only did the public have good ideas as to what we could physically build and how we should set up programs to anticipate our future risk conditions, they had good ideas about big picture typologies, right? They had good ideas about how we should live with water. They had good ideas about what needs to happen on a ground level basis, right? Within each individual parcel and housing unit to store in water, to live with water, to maintain some semblance of our culture, even in an age in which risk increases. Oh, I just spilled coffee on this computer. That's great. Does anybody have a... Thank you. We also talked about critical services. We also talked about, where should we think about building those places that we need to have in operation based on an increasing sense of flood risk. And we got a lot of good feedback about very basic ideas that say, well, okay, our hospitals should probably be on the highest ground, and we should think about transportation networks that can access those hospitals at all times, regardless of what may be happening otherwise. We started talking about the fact that our coast is an economic driver, it's a cultural driver, it's essential to the Louisiana way of life, and we need to maintain a series of supply chains that continue to grant us access to that coast, even if it may not be a place that is going to be suitable for large-scale habitation in the future. We still have to maintain access. So if you see the kind of like the little ship symbol that's way off into the sea, that's a facility called Port Fourchon. So to put that in stark contrast, if a place like Port Fourchon is going to need to remain to be a viable facility moving forward, and it's not likely that anybody's going to be living anywhere near there, what does that mean for a place like Golden Meadow, which if you follow that little purple blob that is Port Fourchon up to kind of where you see like this, I don't know, this green configuration. Anyway, what kind of goods and services need to be at this last waypoint before you get on this causeway to go to this big industrial facility, right? You know, what kind of gas stations, medical facilities, what needs to be there? How do we program that out? How do we think about growth corridors in the sense that we maintain a supply chain to our coast, but we also think about future growth and development in those areas that are naturally higher and drier. So I'll leave you with a few takeaways. So, you know, government has the resources and expertise to develop good information as the basis for public discourse around climate adaptation planning. I think we just need to be really clear with the point that, you know, one of the things government can do and what government should do is invest in knowledge, right? Now, that knowledge obviously has to be paired with good information on the ground, engaging with people, right? One of the things that I say all the time, I have an office in Baton Rouge, I have an office in New Orleans, I live in New Orleans, I can't see the coast from either of those places, I don't live in any of these communities we've been working in. So what I care about isn't really that important, but I can bring good data to the table to inform a conversation. 2, government has the organizational power to form diverse partnerships and provide a forum to the public to use good information to engage in ideation and debate around climate adaptation. So, you know, one of the things that I've not done service to through this conversation is the fact that we built a really diverse team. We partnered with the Foundation for Louisiana. They brought investment to the table to help us really connect with people on the ground. They brought a series of NGOs that they work with on the ground on a daily basis anyway. We also combined with nonprofits, and you'll hear from one of those with Justin and the Center for Planning Excellence later on. We brought in the private sector, so this was really a multifaceted team that took on this project. It wasn't just the state. It was the state and partners, and really, like, you know, the state was not even heads and shoulders above those partners. It was an equal effort. So 3, government is the platform to synthesize findings and outcomes into actionable plans. And so the fact that we released this series of 7 planning documents and the fact that we have a governor that endorsed the findings of those documents, now we have something that we've put down on paper, we have a plan of action, we can move forward from there. Finally, it also has the responsibility to carry out these plans, monitoring progress and outcomes, right? We have capacity, we have money, we can do the things we say that we're gonna do. So finally, I will leave you with one last idea. So my friend Bruce Lee, you know, he talks about being like water, right? And if you pour water into a cup, water forms in the cup. You pour it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. That's how we have to think about our future, right? We can't necessarily affect the teapot in so much as we can't necessarily affect what the coast may look like. We can't engineer our way out of the problem, but we can adapt to it. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we have Nancy Clark, who's here from the University of Florida.
It's presentation 3. Hello, it's great to be here. It's really exciting, the presentations yesterday. Before I start my presentation, I do want to acknowledge the team that I'm here representing. Planning for the reconstruction of Puerto Rico post Hurricane Maria requires diversity of expertise, perspectives, and experiences, and we're really excited about the coalition that we and the group, the team that we've established over the past year. Of course, academics, we have universities from Puerto Rico, the university's Center for Puerto Rican Studies here in New York, Orlando, there's a huge diaspora in Orlando, as well as the University of Florida. Of course, local NGOs have been critical. They know what's going on, they already have ideas, they contribute a tremendous amount for us. Agencies, it's important to engage the agencies. They're looking for ideas. They're looking for solutions. I don't know about implementation all the time, but there's a dialogue that needs to happen. And then the next step, obviously, is what we're trying to do is connect projects, proposals, pilots to funding. And we're at the very beginning stages of that. And municipalities, planning, departments, as well as a whole host of students, an army of students. This is only a third of the students that have been involved in the past year and a half in this project. It's so exciting to see how engaged they are in this question and how much they want to participate. So we've been doing a number of projects across the island, or proposals, planning proposals across the island, but always trying to think of a regional or river-based scale. You can see from this drawing, there's a central mountain range, and then there's rivers that go from the mountains to the coast, cutting through several municipalities. There's 78 municipalities in Puerto Rico. So the river basins don't mind those political municipal boundaries. And we also have some guiding principles that we use to different degrees depending on the project. For example, we had the opportunity to look at the Louisiana River Basin, which has a lot of problems, and there isn't any set project from the Corps of Engineers yet. So we saw it as an opportunity to really think about nature-based water management from the mountains to the coast, and then leveraging that for economic development. But I really want to focus on research that we've been doing on the North region, Central North region, mostly because it's here where we're looking at this idea of retreat and receiving cities. So we've done a preliminary visioning plan. I don't have time to talk about that at any length, but I do want to focus on the pilot, two of the pilot communities that we are looking at in terms of the kinds of investments that might take place. So we have Arecibo, which is on the west end of the region. It was one of the original cities. Pueblo Arecibo was founded in Puerto Rico 1610. Toa Baja, which is to the east, in the 1700s. It's interesting, Toa Baja, most of the pueblos are well located on a higher ground, but not all of them. And Toa Baja is an example of not a great decision of founding the pueblo. From the beginning, it was flooded. There was a group of the community that got tired of the flooding in 1830, 1831. They banded together and they purchased property really nearby in a place they called Dorado. So it was an unofficial pueblo until 1845, 1842, when the government funded civic infrastructure and it became an official town. So we have local relocation in the 1800s. Of course, they had the ability to purchase that land, and also the other problem is Toa Baja continued to develop with lower income communities. I'm going to run out of time. Okay, looking at the impact of Hurricane Maria, of course, devastating storm, but we also have to understand the situation prior to Maria in terms of why it was so devastating. One of the issues is the development policies. Some stats that are important: 60% of the population live in the 44 coastal municipalities. 15% of the population are in areas subject to flooding, and 88,000 of those households are under the poverty level, with the rest of those households being just barely above the poverty level. So we have a high-risk area and high social vulnerability. It's also important beyond flooding to remember that there's a 44% poverty rate in the Puerto Rico island-wide. So a low estimate, in my opinion, 40% of the housing on the island is informal. And so it explains why 60% of the FEMA individual applications were denied. And if we compare that to Harvey, 30% of the applications in Texas were denied. So we have a double that, and it's because of the informality and the lack of the ability to prove that ownership of the property. So the governor was, after Maria, was interviewed about the informality on the island and what would he say to these communities, and his comment was, it's time to go. We have to eradicate informal housing. And so we've heard a lot over the past day and a half about how tricky that is. Choosing where to invest and where not to invest. It looks like there is not going to be investment in some of these 500 communities in the floodplains. We decided at this point to not focus on who's moving, but where they would move to. And so we're really looking at where the potential receiving cities are, and what will it take to encourage people to relocate on their own, and prepare these cities for potential relocation. So there was a couple things we were thinking about. The contraction in the population is actually an opportunity to contract development and to concentrate the population in urban centers. In relationship to that, we really look towards the Pueblo core towns. This is a historic photograph of Arecibo. There's a strong cultural and heritage base assets there, many historical buildings. There's a sense of urbanity, well-built community that is basically a ghost town right now. It's completely empty, so we'll talk a little bit about why. But it's an opportunity, it has the ingredients, we believe, to be repopulated and revitalized. We agree with the idea of vacant housing stock to transfer that into a affordable housing program, a buyout. And then the last thing is really to make it work, you need economic development in these receiving communities. There has to be a reason for people to want to go there. There has to be jobs and quality of life. Looking at out-migration, depopulation, the 2006, we saw a change in the dynamics of migration. It used to be sort of a back and forth. In 2006, that changed radically. And it's really heartbreaking to see the graph on the right, which is if things don't change, by 2060, the population of the island could be decreased in half what it was just before Maria hit. So something has to change. If we look at the two pilot sites that we're thinking about, Arecibo is right near the coast, but it's on a high plateau, a ridge. So we're looking at 25 to 60 feet just for the Pueblo. And if you move west, it's very high as well. So it's a great place outside of the floodplain, but nearby communities that are at risk. And Dorado's the same, 15 to 50 feet. Quickly, I'll go through this. Vacant homes, Arecibo, again, devastated. If we look at the poverty level, about half of Arecibo is below 50% poverty. Just very quickly, looking at this chart, you can see the red line. That's the 2006 recession. There was something called the Section 936 IRS initiative, and that was enacted in the 70s to encourage, it was a tax break for U.S. companies, they could repatriate their earnings back to the mainland. And that had a huge impact on the economy and continued to rise up until the phasing out of it in 2006, and then we see the downturn from there. Looking at damage, Hurricane Maria, looking at the two sites, it's not so bad if you look at the graphics, the triangles and the circles. Dorado is the same, but if you look at Toa Baja, it's devastating. So, and if we zoomed out more, you would see much more devastation around these communities for obvious reasons. We are working with Centro, and they are doing something very important, which is trying to identify where exactly the vacant housing units are. So right now they're at this block scale, but what needs to happen, and we started to do, is a parcel by parcel, because we need to see, which ones can be revitalized, which ones are actually in a good place to revitalize, and are there clusters? Because I think if there's clusters, you can start to have affordable neighborhoods. The problem or the situation is that we're not the only people doing this. Developers are actively right now creating maps to identify these sites and these clusters for new development. So there's a fear that this idea of an affordable housing program with rental units will not happen because of land speculation. So we have to see about that. We're working with HUD to come up with a program for that. So we're also working on PRIDCO, which was a government-based program established in the 40s to change the economy from agriculture to industrial. And in the 936 tax incentive, Puerto invested in infrastructure, buildings all across the island to encourage these companies to come and settle in Puerto Rico. Of course, 2006 and then Hurricane Maria, at this point we have approximately, it's a moving target, but approximately 1.4 billion square feet of vacancy in these government-owned properties. They're in great places, often near communities and cities and towns. So we think it's an amazing, oh, and by the way, that 1.4 million isn't the land, that's just the footprint of the building. There's a lot of land around some of these buildings. So we think it's a great opportunity for economic development, reprogramming these for various uses. So we have sort of started a catalog of the kinds of programs that could be retrofitted in these buildings and then trying to match them with community needs. That's what we've done in Dorado. That's really the focus of the pilot project in Dorado. The buildings in red, not the circle, but the buildings in red are the abandoned, vacant Puerto buildings. And so we've incorporated that into a master plan. I don't have time to talk about that right now, but just so you can kind of visualize the idea. One of the things that's needed in the island is capacity building and workforce development. There's a fear that there's a lot of work that needs to happen, a lot of things are going to happen, and they don't have the training and the workforce to do it. So one of the things, oh my goodness, okay, is this idea to have a vocational school for disaster mitigation, green skills training. So, you know, for how to build dunes, wetlands, and so forth. This is actually interesting because we presented a bunch of projects to the EDA, and this is a project they're very interested in, so we're trying to take the next step in this project. Really quickly, horizontal levee. I don't have time to talk about some of the water management strategies, but as opposed to Louisa, Dorado and Arecibo, already the Corps of Engineers have funding to put levees along the river. And it's a done deal. They've already started in Dorado. So our idea, you know, we can't do room for the river here. It's a little bit late. They're not going to reapply for that funding because it takes decades. So our idea is to introduce something called the living levee, which doesn't change the design of the levee itself, but introduces wetland areas. It actually claims for wetland recreation, areas around the levee to keep encroachment. Our proposal doesn't rely on the functioning of that levee. We've been disappointed in the past with these situations. It also enhances habitat and introduces new habitat. So the last thing I want to talk about is Arecibo. I'm going to have to do this quickly. The North region has amazing natural resources. It has the third largest cave system in the world. It has archaeological sites, protected natural areas. Caño Tiburones is the largest wetland in Puerto Rico. People come from all over the world to study habitat in Caño Tiburone. So a group of NGOs in the sciences driven, oh no, really? Okay, just 1 minute. Driven by the CARTS Institute, have been donated a building that was built in a school that was abandoned, which is the Aqua building, to put an institute. And so this is really interesting. It's a private-public initiative. So they're putting in money and they're hoping to get grants. And the idea is to make this a hub so that people come for meetings and there's a hotel and research, and they go out and do field studies all around this area, the island. The people that are spearheading this live in Arecibo. They love Arecibo. They're sort of sad about the situation, and so we're working with them on that. And the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll be done, is we think that Arecibo is like the really great place for a receiving city. It's in a great location. It's on the coast. There's plenty of already built conditions that are worthy of renovation, and there's historic and cultural and environmental assets. And that's it. So, okay.
Thank you, Nancy. Next, we have Thaddeus Pawlowski from the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes here at Columbia University.
Hello, good morning. Just gonna grab my presentation here. Try to go fast because I really hope we can have a discussion. It's so great when we can get together and learn from different cities. I just hit Control L and it rotated my screen. Do that again.
Maybe
So
try
different
going to view.
view. It's usually Control L. Full screen.
Yeah.
Control F, in case anybody needs to know. Okay, so I'm Thaddeus Pawlowski. I teach urban design and urban planning here at Columbia. But before that, I worked in various capacities in New York City government. And I'm going to talk generally about some lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy. But first, last year, I left government and we started a new center at Columbia to help communities around the world adapt to climate change. So we have this program called the Resilience Accelerator. We're working with Rockefeller Foundation and 100 resilient cities to go to places that are on the front lines of climate change and help them make plans for adaptation by bringing together multidisciplinary research, stakeholder convenings, and documenting outcomes. And really, we think that there's just an incredible urgency to this work right now, as I'm sure all of you do too. And we think we need to really change patterns in our profession to address this urgency. So I look at that, first of all, from my own point of view as someone trained in architecture and urban design. And so I'll talk a little bit about how our field is sort of adapting to address these issues and how Hurricane Sandy really challenged us to do that. So one of the key lessons we learned after Hurricane Sandy was that every neighborhood should have a disaster recovery plan before a disaster happens. New York City had a really sophisticated emergency management plan for how you would evacuate the city and shelter people, but neighborhood level planning for disaster didn't really exist before Hurricane Sandy. And it's really hard to have those conversations about long-term resilience during the recovery process, is what we learned. So I was working at emergency management 10 years ago and longer ago, when we started to say, well, what would happen? How would New York City rebuild after a disaster? So we had a design competition, and we tried to bring together lots of different voices to think about this. And I'm gonna just sort of fly through these because I want to save time for more conversation. But we basically showed people a scenario about New York City getting hit by a major hurricane, and no one was really thinking about it at that time. It had been like maybe 50 years since New York City had a really serious hurricane, but we have 580 miles of coastline, and we had these flood maps that were like grossly outdated. They were made in 1983, and they basically hadn't been updated seriously, and our whole land use on the waterfront had changed dramatically during that time, and our coastline had changed, and sea level rise and other factors were making storms much more plausible and potentially catastrophic occurrence. So we had this design competition and asked people what would happen in the New York City neighborhood if 20,000 units of housing got destroyed and we had to rebuild from the ground up. We got all these crazy ideas. But most of all, it sparked a conversation about, okay, what would happen? How would we keep neighborhoods together? And we weren't talking about retreat at this time because we had a feeling that New York City has dealt with a lot in its past. In fact, New York City is a very resilient place. And so reconstruction seemed to be, the primary goal after any disaster. And therefore, is there a way that we could reconstruct in place so that their lives wouldn't be upended? As we saw so unfortunately happen in Hurricane Katrina, that 50% of the population ended up having to move to Houston or other places, and the city that came back, you guys know, wasn't exactly the same city. So we didn't want to see that happen in New York City neighborhoods. We wanted to keep them together, keep that community cohesion together. So we thought if we could define some form of temporary housing, then we could allow communities to build back more resilient, change underlanding land use patterns and infrastructure and rethink the coastline, yes, but still rebuild neighborhoods. So we built a prototype of this housing and behind the Office of Emergency Management. It's sort of deployable housing that could sit lightly on the ground. People could live there while their neighborhood gets rebuilt, and they could be part of that reconstruction effort. So we were doing this sort of long-term planning efforts, and to be frank, not many people were paying attention. And then Hurricane Sandy hit, and so our focus really changed. And Hurricane Sandy, you might have talked a little bit about it during the conference, and I know lots of you were here. It happened late in the year, and so like at the end of hurricane season, so it was really cold. It snowed like the next week, and I went to work in the mayor's office on housing recovery, and our primary objective was to get people back home as quickly as possible because we saw like a cold weather public health emergency on the horizon. So the city and FEMA worked together on this rapid repairs program, basically shelter in place. And that early decision about sheltering in place and putting people back in their home sort of set up the framework for the long-term community development block grant program, the Build It Back program, which now has built, I think, built or renovated about 5,000 housing units and done repair work on significant, maybe 10,000 more in the southern coast of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. This is probably the most significant public investment that lots of these communities have gotten in a very long time. It's really changed the landscape. And basically, the whole idea of Build It Back, at the time, there was a lot of debate. Build it back? Really? Build it back or build it better? You know, what's really the answer here? So we ended up with Build It Back, but stronger and safer. Sort of a caveat. So this, another general lesson is that designers can work, can use a new set of tools to work with communities. And I think that was really evidenced beautifully in Matt's presentation, that there's communities aren't designers, they aren't planners, but we professionals can be tools of their aspirations. And so we got to see a little bit how that worked after Sandy in New York, and I think that learning is translated across to not just disaster recovery, disaster mitigation, but I think that these challenges make us better at our day-to-day work as planners and designers as well. So we did a lot of conversations with communities, just understanding, the power of visualization, to see your neighborhood, to see the information, the flood risk information. We got new flood maps after Sandy, trying to socialize that to people, understand climate change projections, sea level rise, different scenarios of sea level rise, and trying to help people understand that in the context of the decision that they had to make immediately. And that decision in a lot of places was, am I going to rebuild, or am I going to try to find some place else to live? Because Sandy, as a lot of you know, it affected a lot of different kinds of infrastructure and housing stock, but a lot of the damage was in single-family, low to middle income housing, the last pieces of affordable home ownership in the New York City region. So this is one of those neighborhoods. This is in Staten Island, and we were having a conversation with the community about whether they wanted to build in place or leave. This particular community in Midland Beach, a lot of people wanted to leave, and some people just wanted to leave everything altogether. And we started to, but it started to inform a set of long-term planning decisions that manifest in both. There were many parallel planning efforts after Sandy, and it's hard to talk about all of them, but the governor's office and the mayor's office and locally led efforts. And so these conversations, even though there was some amount of planning fatigue, they started to really change some of the long-term planning decisions about infrastructure, land use, and other things that are going to affect these communities in the long term. But in terms of like housing and understanding what happened during housing, we had a lot of conversations with communities where it was just like, tell us what happened to your house and how you want to fix it. And this particular feedback loop is something that really, I think, is foundational to the change that's going on in our professions as designers now is that we can listen to people, use visualization to understand different sets of options, and then feed that directly back into policy. And so we saw that with this Sandy Design Help Desk, where we trained architects in all of this complex, interconnected building code, flood zone regulations, zoning, engineering, the latest in engineering, and sent them out into communities and said, just draw people's houses with them and just, figure out how they got flooded and what the particular path to resilience is. And then they would draw that, and then they would say, but this part doesn't work because of this regulation and zoning or building code. And then the building code or the zoning people would start to try to figure out how that particular thing could be amended. So I'm just going to jump sort of further ahead and talk to close here about one particular neighborhood, Edgemere in southern Queens. I'm going to give a tour tomorrow morning. Unfortunately, because this is a low-density residential neighborhood, if you haven't signed up already, I can't take you, but maybe you could go on your own sometime. There's a lot of great neighborhoods all over New York City that have had different paths toward reconstruction after Sandy. And so Edgemere is on Jamaica Bay, and it's, as I said, low to middle income home ownership, primarily home ownership, although there's some public housing there. Like there's a lot of public housing in our flood zones, as a lot of and so it had a lot of damage after Sandy. So HPD, the Housing Preservation and Development part of New York City government, and the mayor's office and city planning led about a one-year planning process to help the people of Edgemere think about their future, both and not to just think about flood risk in the future, but transportation and housing affordability and open space. Think about all these things comprehensively, and to devise a long-term vision for what they wanted their neighborhood to be. And we made these sort of scenarios. There's one scenario where the neighborhood keeps flooding, and if you project that into the long term, what we think will happen in a neighborhood like this is that there's sort of two distinct paths. There's one where the wealthy will rebuild and they'll be able to hang on. Maybe they'll even expand and find a way to adapt. And then the poor will be driven further out of the city or into more vulnerable locations. And so we think that there's a third way, which is that if we can, do some part of managed retreat from the most vulnerable areas, construction of infrastructure like a raised coastal edge that could protect against sea level rise, and simultaneously provide benefits in terms of capturing water in parks or public amenity through being closer to nature. And then there's also an opportunity to densify the housing and in the higher ground. And so I encourage people while you're here to check out some additional work that New York City's done after Hurricane Sandy. This is just a summary drawing that New York City Planning did of trying to approach our long-term resilience at multiple scales and multiple systems. So that concludes my talk, and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. So our final presentation is from Justin Kozak from the Center for Planning Excellence.
All right, again, my name is Justin Kozak. Happy to be here in the Center for Planning Excellence. We're a nonprofit based out of Baton Rouge. Thanks to Matt, he kind of, talking about Louisiana and some of the challenges we face, I'll be able to step through this a little quicker so we can get to that discussion that I think we all want. So as a nonprofit, we're about a dozen people. We are scientists, landscape architects, and planners. We work at all scales, from the local community level, area plans, to parish or regional level. We worked with Matt and his group on the LA Safe plans, authoring or co-authoring all 6 parish plans and a regional plan. So some of these images will look a little familiar to you. But for this, we're going to revisit resilience strategies in Jean Lafitte, which is in Jefferson Parish, one of those LA Safe parishes. And we're going to look more at a local level and kind of try to put that in the context of managed retreat. So as planners, we sometimes, as we work in smaller communities and you try and have a long-term outlook on things, on climate change, it can feel untenable. They don't think they can impact something. But if we look at the numbers and if we look at the increase in billion-dollar disasters, most of that is not being caused by climate change or the increased intensity of storms. Most of that is because we are putting more things and people in harm's way. And if you model that out in this Reguero paper, he was looking at the cost effectiveness of different adaptation or risk mitigation strategies, but buried in there was these economic projections and these climate change projections. And what stuck out to me is that 75% of the increase in damage from a 100-year storm in 2050 is caused by us putting more things on the ground and not climate change. And that's something that people at a local level, where land use decisions happens, we can actually have an impact on, and people feel that they can control that a bit. So just a couple of things that we try and bring to this is we recognize stationarity is dead, right? That we're a no analog future. We can't look to the past to understand what's going on in the future. We only have reasonable estimates there. And, I hear a lot of talk about solutions, but I think using that word, especially in this context, is disingenuous to the future generations that are going to have to address this problem. And it's a little arrogant to think that this is like changing a light bulb and we can just make it work. So I'd prefer if we all use the word strategies, because that sets that dialogue that this is going to be an ongoing thing that we're going to have to revisit in the future. Also, we have a lot of uncertainty. So this work was funded through a NOAA Climate and Ocean Applications Program grant. We're partnered with Louisiana Sea Grant and the Center for Hazards Assessment, Response, and Technology at University of New Orleans. We're doing a couple things here. We are, revisiting resilience. We're doing a pre-disaster redevelopment plan in the Lafitte area, essentially a resilience plan. And then we're working on creating a transferable guide for other communities. I'm going to focus on that first one today. So the Jean Lafitte area actually already has a resilience plan. It was written in 2013. We were part of that effort. It was pretty successful. We had 25% participation rate from the community, which is a huge number. It's a community, about 3,500 people, and really focused around 6 principles of resilience: living with water, assessing opportunities and threats. And the vision was really just hoping for and working towards a future in which you maintain the bayou culture, the bayou character, and you maintain high quality of life in spite of storms and sea level rise for future generations. But this being Louisiana, a lot can change in 6 years, both from a planning perspective, from a landscape perspective. And so there's a need to update resilience strategies. So we've done over 20 interviews with residents, business owners, people at the parish level, people at the local level. We've had focus groups with parish and community staff. We've reviewed all the plans that they have on the books. We've done some research into future projections. So where is this? It's southeast Louisiana. It's, depending on traffic on the bridge, anywhere from a half hour to an hour and a half south of New Orleans. So it's pretty close to a largest metropolitan area in Louisiana, but it might as well be a world away. It's tucked in, it's down a bayou. From the south, from the lower left-hand corner of that picture to the top part of it, that's the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. Snaking down through the center of that study area is Bayou Barataria. Town of Jean Lafitte's an incorporated community. It has a mayor, a floodplain manager, and a sheriff. That's it. That's the entire town staff. Barataria and Lafitte, they're all kind of looked at as one common area. There's one road in and out of it. The mayor will tell you, he's like, well, my wife's family lives in Lafitte, my family lives in Barataria, so if I only think about Jean Lafitte, I got a lot of problems at home. So, and that's how the parish kind of addresses it too. They look at this as a cohesive whole. So, put this in an environmental context. Some of these, this will be good. I'll just kind of point out where Jean Lafitte is. If we look at 1960, which there's already been significant land loss by this point, but moving forward, we see the deterioration of the wetlands, barrier islands, the retreat of or I guess the invasion of saltwater into this area. Moving forward, 2067 looks pretty stark. Jean Lafitte doesn't look very viable, but as Matt was saying, we have a $50 billion master plan, and it gets us that, which is not a lot, but for the Lafitte area, it seems to be they're kind of drawing a line in the sand there a little bit. However, they still need to adapt because they have high flood risk now. The entire area is about 7 to 9 feet base flood elevation. And moving forward, that's going to increase even with our best efforts at restoring wetlands and diverting floodwaters and building levees and offering protection. But with that, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So we know the uncertainty in sea level rise projections, and that is manifested in the plan as well. We have low to high scenarios. These are from the 2017 plan. Without the plan, worst case scenario, we're losing another 4,000 square miles in 50 years. With the plan, that knocks it down to about 3,000. In a medium scenario, we're still looking at another 1,500 square miles of land loss. I will say that it may not be the case for this plan, but the 2 previous iterations of this plan, the worst case scenario has become the best case scenario as that climate science has moved forward. But we also need to look at the socioeconomic context, right? It's not just about assessing risk. It's about looking at vulnerability and changes in the community and, bringing strategies that are relevant to them. The oil and gas industry, if I can quote Homer Simpson, the cause of and solution to all of the area's problems. We have a lot of active oil wells. However, this area is turned into a bit of flyover country. As oil and gas operations have moved further offshore, there's been less need for the support industries, less people living in these communities because it's not as easy to get out to those deeper rigs. Since 2014, nearly 40% of people employed, they've lost nearly 40% of employment in oil and gas. That's a continuing trend. It's expected to continue in the future. In this area, the state actually has more jobs in restoration and water management than they do in oil and gas at this point. Its prime location at the north end of Barataria Basin, or the Barataria Bay, and close to a large market. It was ideal for the commercial fishing industry, but international competition has driven prices down. If you've been to Louisiana, if you've been to New Orleans and you've gone and eaten a seafood, there's a good chance you weren't eating Louisiana seafood. There's processor limits, so even if they do come in with a boat full of shrimp, they can't sell them because there's limits to how much the seafood processors can take. And fuel costs. One of the fishermen we interviewed said it best: shrimp's too low, diesel's too high. But its location near a large market also has seen a large change from commercial to charter fishing. Recreation is increasing. So a lot of these boat captains that have the knowledge, that have the equipment, have transferred over to taking people out on out fishing. And so we've seen a large growth in that industry in this area. Population's decreased about 25 a quarter in the study area from 2000 to now. There's larger population losses in the unincorporated areas. Jean Lafitte's still down though. The median age is increasing as that population changes. Median income is flat in Jean Lafitte, and in Lafitte in the Barataria area it's decreasing. Workforce, in-area jobs, people that work in the Lafitte area, that's down. And it's always been a bedroom community. In 2000, about 87% of the people that lived there and were employed had jobs outside of the community. Now that's up to about 93%. But those people that are living and working are older, and the income levels have skewed towards the higher end. So the people who are remaining aren't entry-level positions. They're not low-paying jobs. It very much is a bedroom community that's aging. And that has implications because, we know costs are rising. Insurance premiums are going up. Homeowners insurance in Jefferson Parish has more than doubled in the last generation. Flood insurance is going up 6% nationwide on average, but in high-risk areas it's going up even more. So if you have an aging population on fixed income, that's something that makes people more vulnerable. They're less able to protect their investments. They're less able to afford insurance. And then you may also have heard of Mayor Tim Kerner, pictured in the center here. You read about him in the New York Times, I believe it was last year. He recognized years ago that with the population he had, he was never going to be able to afford or be able to win the cost-benefit analysis to get a 100-year protection ring levy around this area. So he did what to him is a very logical thing. He started investing, and he started putting things on the ground to tip that scale so that he could make the case for investing in other things. He put in a fisheries market. He put in an auditorium, a boxing gym, a senior center, a museum that celebrates its pirate or profiteer history. And he's done a lot of work in this, and that may be an indictment of the cost-benefit ratio, but for him it makes sense and it's a way forward. So at what point managed retreat in Jean Lafitte? They have higher risk in the future. There's land loss that's going on. I argue that we're already seeing it. They certainly wouldn't call it managed retreat, but you have a mayor, you have a strong leader with a boxing past, and so I'll use an analogy for him, that's rolling with the punches. As things are changing, he's moving with it. We've seen homes, they've retreated up. They've adopted higher building standards. Jean Lafitte and Jefferson Parish and those unincorporated areas have 2 feet of freeboard. Jefferson Parish actually has the highest CRS score in the state of 5. Everybody gets a 25% discount on their flood insurance premiums. They have higher building standards. We've also seen that economic shift as the commercial fishery has been less lucrative. We see it shifting more towards recreational. And they've capitalized on that industry and the nearness to the market and the accessibility to Barataria Bay. And we also have a shift in housing stock. Just because we've lost a quarter of the population doesn't mean those houses are sitting empty. We see a lot of people buying them as second homes because of their location. It's a quick weekend jaunt out of New Orleans, and they're being Airbnb'd out, or they're just vacation homes. That does change the face of the community, but it maintains a tax base, and those are mitigated properties that don't increase the vulnerability of an area. Like I said, we've seen a lot of public investment. The senior center benefits and goes along with the strategy to, paying attention to that increasing age in the area. The fish market supports a public place for the recreational and charter fishing. And the Wetlands Education Center. That's actually a project funded from the LA Safe program. And it's coming in to kind of capitalize on that tourism and the education of some of these issues that are going on in Louisiana. And so they're not getting a ring levy, but they are getting a series of ring levies, tidal ring levies. So it'll be about 7.5 feet tall. They won't be 100-year protection. They'll prevent some nuisance flooding in areas, but these are going to go in stages. And thank you. And so, kind of in the center top of that area, that's the Fisher Basin Ring Levee. That'll be done later this year. The yellow area at the top right, that's Rosethorn. That'll be finished by probably the end of next year. And so that will offer some protection and prevent some nuisance flooding. And then we also have to look at this in the broader coastal context. We have this master plan. One of the premier projects in it is a sediment diversion that's taking place just to the southeast of Jean Lafitte. There's large coastal restoration, large marsh restoration just south of it. There's a barrier island program, and then there's a non-structural program that helps fund adapting structures to increased flood risk. So I picked a couple of the resilience strategies that are more applicable here and some of my favorites. So in the near term, they do need to revisit their stormwater evacuation and disaster response strategies. These tidal ring levees, while they can hold more water out, will also hold more water in. It'll take longer to pump them out. Their location at the entrance of this area means that it may delay time in which you can respond to a disaster, or it may prevent people from evacuating. From a stormwater management perspective, in this image, we see Jean Lafitte is actually about between 0 and 3 feet at an elevation. Behind New Orleans area, they've pumped a lot of, and they actually are at like 10 feet below sea level. So they don't want to make those same mistakes in that. And also, like, these ring levees are a barrier to flow. If you're trying to evacuate or you have nuisance flooding, as that strong wind blows in and you have a high tide event, is it going to cover the roads earlier? Do you now have issues to deal with that evacuation, the response, and just day-to-day things? They also need to revisit the definition of critical and essential facilities from a small town perspective. We know that grocery stores, restaurants, these little social institutions are incredibly important. I recommend a pilot program for the mitigation of these places. A lot of these places are those very institutions that have such small margins that they can't close down for a short period of time to mitigate. So these third places, it's not where people work, it's not where they live, but it's where they congregate, and we know when people are able to congregate, social resilience is stronger. Develop a new seafood model. There's successful business models they can go adopt. In the interest of time, I'll skip the rest of that. I will say there is a seafood labeling bill that is going to have implications for local fisheries. That recently just passed, and so now restaurants and places are going to have to label that. So now you'll know if you go to New Orleans and are eating. And then Radley said we need to talk about ecosystem services. We're restoring all of these wetlands. It would be a shame if they didn't also get paid for all the carbon they're storing in these coastal environments. And Louisiana has all of the infrastructure to monitor and report on that and move forward with that. So what do we learn? It's more than moving people, more than moving structures. It's a continuous process that you have to revisit and re-strategize. Jean Lafitte is probably an anomaly. It's got a strong leadership and that has a capacity for change, which is kind of unique in Louisiana. And you also need to de-silo efforts. Too often we see hazard mitigation plans not being consulted when you're doing an economic development or a comprehensive plan. So bring it all together, try and leverage your resources so you can do more. Thank you.
Could I ask the panelists to please join me up here? So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'd like to start just by asking 2 questions myself. One of them I'll ask first is for Antonia. Yeah, wherever you like. And the second, I'd like to have Matthew, Nancy, Thaddeus, and Justin answer in turn. So my question for Antonia excuse me, is about what to consider in retreat planning and processes when it comes to children. Because from what I understand, people with children, sometimes that winds up being like discouraging retreat because people want to keep their kids in the same schools, near their friends, and so on. From a number of people I talked to in my research, having children was actually a motivation to retreat because the kids were dealing with PTSD, were scared, about coming home, but also I saw them split up through the buyout process as families proceeded on different timelines, and all of someone's friends would disappear and they were still in the same house. So that's my question for you. And then my question for each of the other panelists has to do with this role of planners in having produced vulnerability and inequity. And so, we know historically planners have been key agents in sort of advancing racist and segregationist and colonial and settler colonial projects. And so my question is, how, in your view, what tools do you have as planners or through these planning processes you're talking about, how have those focused on both addressing that history and sort of the role of planners and having produced many of these impacts and unequal impacts, and then what do you see as opportunities for redressing that history and those impacts through your planning processes? And so maybe in the Louisiana context, thinking about Ile de Jean Charles, which you didn't talk as much about, but kind of that difficult conversation about balancing tribal sovereignty and resettlement in that process. In Puerto Rico, obviously, that kind of colonial history, many of the debates that are happening now. In New York, this kind of resilience gentrification idea and developers and capital, and sort of that idea that through some of these resilience investments, you might wind up displacing the very people the projects are intended to protect, and so on. So those are my questions for the panelists initially.
What we've sort of observed and through the lesson learned and the implementation of this project, so mental health issues are one of the main concerns with child-serving institutions related to children. So I feel like when planning for moving, I feel like planning to make sure that children have the coping mechanisms to deal with the disruptions that maybe moving away or everything else that a disaster might impact their lives. So making sure that mental health issues are well covered and that families and child-serving institutions are able to recognize the mental health symptoms of those impacts on children. I feel like those are one of the main points that are always discussed in communities related to the impacts of children. And also, in Puerto Rico, at least, we've seen that because so many teachers left the island and because so many schools were closed, a lot of people actually left because of that consideration, because they didn't want their kids to miss school so much, and a lot of families couldn't find, for example, formula for their kids, and because of that, because of those concerns, a lot of families actually decided to move away, and a lot of them basically didn't return because a lot of schools and a lot of those issues actually haven't been resolved. So making sure that, so to close, making sure that parents and families and child serving institutions basically are aware to recognize the symptoms and that they have the tools to give children to cope with those mental health issues and the disruptions that means in their lives.
I guess I'll start with the second question. That was quite the scathing indictment of the planning industry.
I'm in a planning department now. That's all we students about.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not untrue. You know, I would say, though, that I think as a profession and as a generation of planners that are working in this day and age, you know, we've learned to build a better mousetrap first and foremost, right? I think, you know, we've certainly in the industry put equity as the focus of most of our efforts in the modern day. But, I mean, I think in effectuating a process by which you start at the grassroots and you understand what a community currently is, you know, going through that process, you know, people on the ground will tell you what the inequities are that are built into the communities as they exist. And I think the real opportunity that comes from the unfortunate reality of living in the age of climate change and the age of managed retreat is that, you know, we're going to be in a position in which we're going to have to develop the next generation of villages, towns, and cities as we move forward. And so as we have to go build those new places, right, and this is very much a place-making exercise, we're going to have a fantastic opportunity to build a generation of places that, you know, by their very design, eliminate many of the inequities that have been baked into our current communities by design, right? So, I mean, I think that's an incredible opportunity for those of us that are in this broad profession to look forward to as we move on. You know, to the issue of, you talked about some of the tribal issues relative to the resettlement of Ile-de-Jean-Charles. You know, what I would say in Louisiana is that we have a very muddled landscape, and that you have a lot of different tribal groups, some of which compete with one another. I don't think any of them have been done any great service by the process that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has in place, by which tribal groups get federal recognition. And so for the purposes of the landscape that we work within in Louisiana, none of those groups are federally recognized, and so there is no degree of official sovereignty. Now, I suspect that was not the nature of sovereignty that you were alluding to in your question, but I think that kind of backs into a more broad question that we're beginning to contemplate in regards to all of these low-lying communities that we're working in, and that is, what is community, right? And in some cases, who is best positioned to represent that community? So one of the things that we've built in as a value system across both of the projects that I've had the fortune to lead over the past several years is the idea of self-determination. And so one of the things that we've done with the resettlement project is we've developed individual relationships with the people that live on the island, right? They're not the only members of the broader Ile-de-Jean-Charles community, but those are the people that are currently living in a place of highest risk, and those are the people that we have prioritized to allow to take a role in their own self-determination to build out what the future of that community is going to look like. And so, you know, that's been, you know, a process that not everybody has fully appreciated, but we feel very good about the notion that we're giving people that are living in a place of acute vulnerability a very heightened sense of self-determination, and in many cases, they've taken it and run with it.
I'll elaborate on that too. I think I agree completely, Liz, that, you know, planners have been guilty of terrible racist and colonial work in the past, but I wouldn't assign all of that agency to planners. Really, I feel that planning and design are just tools of power, or have historically been tools of power, and the transition I see going on in the profession is that we're becoming more and more tools of the disempowered. We're becoming a vehicle, our profession is becoming a vehicle through which people who don't always have a voice in these decisions, that voice can be elevated. And that's what we try to train our students in. We feel that it's almost impossible to separate design and activism today. And so I think that's, I think I wasn't here the other night, but I heard someone texted me that Elizabeth, the MP area, really doesn't like this word resilience, this word that I use all the time. She likes resistance. And I was like, I like resistance too. I feel like that is much more where we're heading, that we need to really, in every localized instance, try to build trust, first of all, between, how we can take the resources of planning agencies and the forward momentum of the private sector, and just align all these things so that they are respecting and responding to a clear set of demands that we can hear from the people on the ground. And that's true. I think that's true in all our work in general, is that, in New York City, for instance, I live in Red Hook, which is a neighborhood that's sort of probably, one of the top places that you would say there's climate gentrification going on, similar to lots of neighborhoods in Miami. And that there's, some, the higher places are becoming more desirable, and the lower places are getting less desirable, and then any infrastructure that's built is going to reinforce those divisions. But there are ways that we can, use that same infrastructure. Like every infrastructure investment that we make in our neighborhood in Red Hook, we feel like should be one that almost like a percent for social infrastructure, like somehow help us tie the community more tightly together. And that's where I think us designers and planners can have some agency, by asking those questions and trying to just build a coalition against the status quo.
I can pick up on that. So the economic crisis and the development crisis in Puerto Rico's a long, complicated story. The sugar industry encouraged development and housing in the floodplains. The sugar industry significantly altered the natural landscape of the floodplains, creating incredible problems with flooding. If we look at Operation Bootstrap, which was the 40s, when they were trying to move the economy from agriculture to industrial, this question of self-sufficiency became critical, because they no longer were growing their own foods. They left the rural areas and moved into the cities, but there was no housing, so they made housing where they needed to make housing to survive. The elimination of 936 there's many reasons why that tax exemption was eliminated, but one of the main reasons is the mainland had their eye on that money for other purposes. So, and that was a devastating impact. So, it's complicated now. The PROMESA oversight is a real problem. There's a problem with the composition of the PROMESA Oversight Board, and there's a lot of anger towards that. So, so I think it's really a question of self-sufficiency. That's what's happening now in Puerto Rico. But the problem is they don't have the funds to do it. They're $123 billion in debt. In terms of planning, the Junta Planning Board, they had a plan where you weren't allowed to build in these areas, and they never enforced it. So it's not, when the governor said we need to deal with this, it's a question of enforcement, and it's a question of providing the proper housing, for low-income communities, affordable housing, rental units, and then really job creation. So, for us, there's this, we're interested in helping these communities with whatever we can offer as consultants, be self-sufficient, and not be, that's the main thing. So.
I just want to acknowledge, I know we're out of time technically, but if you're able to stay for 10 minutes, I'd like to give Justin a chance to respond if you want to, and then I'll take 3 questions at once and give the panelists the last word.
Okay, well, I won't take 10 minutes for this. I just want to offer a quick comment. You note the history of community planning and some of its more ugly side. But, I feel there's been a merging of social sciences with planning more recently, and I think that's a very good change. And if you were here last night, during the role play, the acting, there's a lot of, we use the word community all the time. And we need to move away from this idea of a community as lines on a map and more people, right? It's those social networks are what make up a community and not a place. There's buildings everywhere. There's not necessarily a community everywhere. So I just want to, if we can focus on the people and the social networks, I think that will put us in a better place to provide what they need or to allow them to design it themselves.
Questions?
You mentioned 2 shifts that interest me. One is the shift to recreational fishing and the shift in housing stock to second homes.
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean that new people are moving in? And if it is, then is it actually possible to help original residents make that shift?
And we'll take one back here.
Also for Justin, but perhaps all of you can answer it. I'm wondering, in the discussion, the planning that you've done, are the communities thinking that these are long-term, these strategies that will work for the long term, or is there a sense that they're buying time for a much different future?
One more? Yeah.
This is kind of a question for everybody. We've heard a lot about governance over the whole few days, and so, we have models of, within families talking to individual children, Village on Charles kind of going house to house, and then, Jean Lafitte having a great mayor, you can go back to the recovery of the Vietnamese after Katrina, having a great church leader. And so we're talking about this in the context of planning and having, kind of finding those governance models that will work for our planning projects. How do you see that feeding into long-term reform of governance structures?
All right.
Okay. The shift in housing and the shift in the economy, yes, it does help support. So like these aren't charter fishermen coming in from elsewhere. They live in the community. And so they're very deliberate in stopping at the grocery store with the people that are coming in and stopping at a restaurant and kind of helping that economy along. Is it, I don't have numbers on comparing, the revenues from commercial fishing compared to this, but, that population is declining. And some people are moving in, others are moving out. Actually, that study about establishing a carbon market is done by a researcher who recently bought a house in Jean Lafitte. She is fully aware of the long-term implications, but invested anyway because of the sense of place and the character of it. Are these people thinking long-term? In most of our work in Louisiana, I suspect this is elsewhere, most people are thinking about tomorrow. They're thinking about getting their kids to school. They're thinking about paying bills. They're thinking about, is my community going to be good the next couple of weeks and not over that long term. With a dozen hurricanes every generation hitting Louisiana, they're no stranger to bouncing back. They're incredibly resilient, and just talking with them, it's kind of uplifting and like seeing the human spirit. But at the same time, you don't have, youth are moving out. You don't have these entry-level jobs. And so there are implications for that down the road, and they're aware of them. But again, it's more of a short-term, I need to be all right tomorrow, and we'll deal with that when we get there.
And to touch on the last question, I feel like with the increased frequency of disasters, communities are realizing that a lot of the responsibility that they would normally put on disaster management at either the state or the federal level or to other organizations, I feel like they're more and more understanding that a lot of the responsibility for at least responding and recovery, it falls on them. That communities need to be more empowered, to be better prepared, and to be better and to respond better. So I feel like communities are kind of taking it in their own hands to be better prepared and to have plans, community level plans and institutional plans without necessarily having to wait for a higher level organization to kind of demand that or actually even help them do it. So I feel like that is kind of changing at least the sense of responsibilities that people have, that people feel on the different governance structures.
Any last words?
I want to add something to what Justin said in that, I think we as practitioners need to take a longer term approach to how we think about climate planning. Because I think, as Justin said, if you talk in the present term, most people are concerned with, the day-to-day needs of their lives, right? But when we look out, say, over a 50-year period of time, a 100-year period of time, you touch into this innate human desire to want superior outcomes for our successors, right? And I think that's where the opportunity really lies. And so I think we've had a unique opportunity in Louisiana to touch into that desire, and I think we've gotten a lot of really good input through that process.
I think that this observation, I'm glad that the conference has been focused on governance, and I think that's something that we've learned in our work is probably that through the change of how our professions approach individual projects or planning efforts, what we're ultimately trying to do is drive some sort of institutional change in the organizations that we work with so that they're more multidisciplinary, that they think long term, that they just have better models for collaboration and input from multiple sources, that they listen to science. And so this long term climate change is not the only thing going on in the next 50 years, right? So I feel like, however, climate change, the focus on long-term thinking that climate change has brought to us should help us solve our other social and environmental justice issues.
Please join me in thanking the panel.